Welcome back, everybody, to the live webinar here at BINA. So the topic of this week is, should we give a baby an anaesthetic by his bris? So obviously anybody that's been to a bris, especially if you're a little bit squeamish and you don't like blood or baby screaming and you get a little bit affected by it, you always wonder, is there anything we can do to alleviate the baby's pain, to make it less? Is the baby really in pain? Is the baby not in pain? And the question is often asked, can we give an anesthetic to a baby who is having a bris? Now, there are a number of things that need to be discussed here. This is obviously a halachic discussion, and it's also a medical discussion. Obviously, I am not a doctor, so please don't take any medical advice from this year. Anything that you practically do, please consult with a doctor. And I'm also not a moyel, actually. So I know a few of the laws of a bris, but I'm not very well versed in it, and I've never really done a bris before, and I actually do not plan on ever doing one. So I'm not going to actually rule on the halachic matter also, but I want to give just a general perspective and a general overview on the concept from the little research that I've done. So, first of all, obviously a general anesthetic nobody would ever do on a baby, because that is, in general, a general anesthetic is quite risky and is associated with many risks, and therefore we don't just do it for a small procedure, and no one would ever think of doing that. What some people do is they do a local anesthetic, and more specifically, not even through a needle, which is quite invasive, but they do it through a cream, some sort of numbing cream that they put on a baby. Now, the first question to ask is there actually any benefit in doing this? Does the baby benefit at all from this? So, I actually researched just a little bit online from what different mohalim, a moel is somebody who actually does the bris, discuss. And I found two articles which actually contradict each other from two different people. One is by Rabbi Moshe Chaim Friedman, and one is by Rabbi Nechemia Markowitz, two moelim who seem to be very, very experienced and who have done many, many brisim in their career as a moel. So I'll just share with you from the first one, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Friedman. He writes that he actually does use this numbing cream. And he says that the baby cries less when, from his experience as a moel, the baby cries less when there is a numbing cream being used prior to the bris. However, even he himself says, in a very joking way, and this is quite hilarious, that actually who this is mainly for is the parents. The parents who are very anxious, very worried. The baby's crying, the baby's in pain, they don't know what to do. I've had, thank God, 2 sons go through a bris. It is a little bit traumatic. It is hard to see your son being cut and pain. So to sort of calm them down, he gives the baby an anesthetic, and the parents are more calm. Hopefully the baby is not going through too much pain. He actually writes over here, I'm just going to quote this word for word because this is just written very well. He says, to relieve some of their anxiety, I jokingly tell them about the moel who had the perfect solution for treating the baby's pain. Both the mother and father should drink a full glass of vodka before the bris, and the baby would not feel any pain at all. In other words, what he's trying to say is, most of the baby's pain during the bris is that it's pain. It's, if anything, for a few seconds, and you don't need to be a doctor for this. Anybody who has children knows that, or you don't need to be a scientist for this. Anybody who has children knows, if they're in pain, they let you know. Nothing will calm the baby down if they have an ear infection. Anybody whose baby has had an ear infection, they'll be screaming and howling, and nothing, even food, will calm them down. You need to use medicine to alleviate the pain, to calm them down. Have you ever been to a bris where a baby is still screaming from the bris 3 hours later? I have been to many brisim, and it's never happened. Never has the baby scream for 3 hours after the bris in pain. Usually after a couple of minutes, especially after you give them back to the mother and they're feeding, they've calmed down. Obviously the pain has not lasted for more than a couple of seconds, maybe minutes. And another thing is interesting, well, the brisim that I've been to, generally the baby actually doesn't start to cry when the cutting begins, when the actual bris begins. Generally the baby starts to cry when their diaper, when their nappy is opened, or when their legs are being held. Anybody who's changed, again, you don't have to be a doctor or a scientist for this, anybody who has babies knows this. When you change a newborn's nappy, they get very, very cranky. They like to be cuddled. As soon as you open up to the air, they start to cry. And this is actually what the other moil that I've quoted of the Rabbi Nechemia Markovitz, he seems to say that no, actually, he claims that he doesn't see any difference between the crying of the baby, whether there is an anesthetic or there's no anesthetic, because the crying has very little to do with the pain, because they barely feel it and they forget about it within a couple of seconds. Another thing that he points out, so that's about, is there a benefit? Is there actually a benefit? Is debatable, and it seems to be that everyone has a different experience, and therefore I would probably suggest, again, I'm not a doctor or a moil, but just using common sense, is that it has actually very little to do with which cream you use. It has probably to do with which moil is doing the bris, or the baby. Every baby is different. If a moil is very experienced, knows how to do it quite quickly, they will be over before it started, and the baby will feel very little pain. Because seeming to, by the discrepancies of the testimonies, if there's a difference in the crying or not, seems to be that it actually makes very little difference. But what Rabbi Nechemia Markovitz points out, and again, I'm not a doctor, I'm just quoting him, is that there's another thing to worry about actually. Is the numbing cream actually good for the baby? And I'm not sure how many parents actually think about this. Again, I'm just pointing it out just to ask the question. Maybe go to a doctor and ask the question, is this actually a good thing? Not only does it have any benefit, which is debatable, the question is actually, is there perhaps a risk in putting such cream on a newborn baby? From the little research that I've done, it may be a risk if some of the cream is left on the baby and there's an open wound, which is obviously what a bris is. That could actually be bad for the baby. So if anything, we're talking about a few seconds of maybe pain, which the baby forgets right afterwards. Otherwise, again, the baby will be howling and screaming for as long as it feels pain. So very little benefit, maybe a little bit of risk, and there's also halachic debate, which we're not going to get into now, but there is halachic debate. Is there a problem in using numbing cream? Now, obviously, there are those that say that it's halachically okay, and therefore any moil that uses it shouldn't be, God forbid, disqualified or anything. They're obviously relying on those people which say it's okay. But why rely on what's called a heter, which means a leniency, when you don't need to? Because it's actually unnecessary. As I mentioned before, even the moil who does do it, who wrote this article, quite an experienced moil, says that it's mainly actually for the parents, to sort of calm down the parents, because they're the most anxious one. The baby barely suffers as a result of it. So that's more on a practical / halachic level. On a philosophical level, on a more perhaps a deeper level, the little pain which is felt by the bris is actually quite an important part of the bris. It may sound a little bit harsh, because again, we're not really talking about, and obviously, if a bris is being done in an adult, which sometimes happens, that's a whole different story, that's a whole different level of pain. Here we're talking about an 8-day-old child. That little pain which the child does feel is actually, on a philosophical and a mystical level, a big part of the bris. And I'll just share this with you in the following context. We know the famous story that when the first Jew had his bris, Abraham, Avraham Avinu, had his bris at the age of 99 years old. Now that's painful. talking about pain, that's painful. And God came to visit him. It says that, Rashi explains, God came to visit him on the 3rd day of his bris. Why did God come to visit him? So it says that God came to visit him, first of all, to visit the sick, but also to heal him, to heal his wound from the bris. And the obvious question is, why did God wait 3 days to come and heal him? Why didn't he come to him on the first day? As soon as he's experienced this pain, let God appear to Abraham and heal him, and finished. There are many answers given to this question. I'll just share with you one of them. The answer is because, apparently, this is what the commentaries explain. I'm not sure how this works on a medical level, but this is what the commentaries explain, is that the pain of the wound of a bris is especially for a 99-year-old, naturally lasts for 3 days. From the 3rd day and onward, it starts to heal. Therefore, when God will come and heal the bris of Abraham, he didn't want that there should be some sort of supernatural healing happening here. Then the first day after the bris, no more pain, no more wound, it should all be healed. No, he wanted him to actually experience the full natural outcome of a bris, and only then, after the 3rd day, then God can come and heal him. Why is it that way? Why is it so important to have the natural outcome, not to have a supernatural recovery? So there are 2 parts to that answer. First of all, something which applies to every mitzvah, and then more specifically about a bris. And by the way, I forgot to say, the reason why we're discussing a bris today, it might sound a little bit random, is because the mitzvah of a bris is mentioned in this week's parsha, Parshas Tazria and Mitzorah, Parshas Tazria. So the answer is as follows. In terms of all the mitzvahs, we are commanded to do mitzvahs in this physical world. Mitzvahs do not exist in the spiritual world. We can only keep mitzvahs in the physical world. And the reason for that is because the purpose of a mitzvah is to bring godliness into this physical world. In order for that to happen, the physical world needs to remain physical. You cannot perform a mitzvah in a supernatural way. Why? Because if you did that, then you haven't really brought God into the physical reality. You've sort of transcended the physical reality and brought God into that. It's actually brought in the name of the Arizal that when he used to go buy an etrog for an esrog for the holiday of Sukkot, he wouldn't bargain with the dealer, he would pay the full price. Why? Because if this is the price for the mitzvah, he's willing to pay it. That is the natural way of keeping the mitzvah. He didn't want to change it even one iota, sort of bargain at a cheaper price. He has to pay the full price for the mitzvah. Why? Because then the mitzvah is being kept fully naturally. There's a famous story about the Baal HaTanya, about the Alter Rebbe, that when he was imprisoned by Tsarist Russia, and he was needed to do Kiddush Levana, which is blessing the moon. He was on a boat around the river, which was around the prison, and he asked the guy to stop the boat because you're supposed to be stationary when you say Kiddush Levana, and he didn't, and miraculously the boat stopped. Then it continued. Then he asked him again, can you stop the boat? And he realized who he's dealing with, so he stopped the boat. And the famous question is, why didn't he just do it the first time? And the answer is because then it's miraculous. It's not natural. Mitzvahs have to be kept naturally, including natural outcomes. Which means if a mitzvah is naturally associated with pain, that means there's supposed to be pain. Again, the pain is very minute, based on what we said before. There is very little pain, and it lasts for a very, very little amount of time. But that little bit of pain is a necessary part of the mitzvah. And that applies to every mitzvah. If the mitzvah has a cost, it's part of the mitzvah. Now, obviously, we're not saying that a person has to go and waste money. But if a mitzvah has a certain cost to it, that's a part of the mitzvah. It's part of keeping the mitzvah in its most natural form. And by doing that, you bring God into the physical world. But more specifically about the bris, and this is again on a philosophical level. When we do a bris to a child, what we're really doing is we're educating them what it means to serve God. Part of serving God is to sacrifice. Judaism, Yiddishkeit, keeping Torah mitzvahs, ultimately leads to the most beautiful life. But it's not easy. And it demands sacrifice. There are things which we're not allowed to eat. There are things which we're not allowed to do. There's things we're not allowed to see. There's things we're not allowed to listen to. And what we do to the child by the bris, from day one, or from the first day possible, the 8th day, we educate the child that we're right now making a covenant between you and God. And that relationship demands sacrifice. And yes, a little bit of pain. The pain on a philosophical level is a part of the bris. We say at a bris, we say a prayer that it should be considered in front of God as if we brought this child as a sacrifice. Now, obviously, we don't bring child sacrifices, God forbid, but it's as if. In order to be as if as a sacrifice, we need to sacrifice something. There needs to be a sacrifice. It can't be painless. And therefore, the concept of having pain by a bris, again, number one, just to recap everything we've said. Number one, it's debatable how much benefit actually the number cream has. It could be the baby feels very little pain regardless. It definitely doesn't feel pain for a very long time. It's definitely a very short amount of time. That's number one. Number two, there could actually be health risks to numbing cream. Again, I'm not a doctor. Something just a question, something to look into. I have seen it being written about. Number three, there could be halachic issues. Again, there are people to rely on to do it that way. I'm not saying it's a perfectly legitimate bris if you use numbing cream, but it's debated. And why get yourself into a halachic problem if it's not such a big deal? And number three, and number four, on a philosophical level, the pain of the bris is a part of the bris. It's a part of educating the child from day one that serving God is not necessarily going to be comfortable. There will be pain involved, sometimes discomfort, but ultimately it's the most beautiful thing because we're connecting ourselves to God. So again, just to finish off what I started off, what to do practically. Everybody has their doctor, everyone has their moil, everyone has their rabbi, and you should consult with all three before you do a bris for your child. But I just wanted to point this out because sometimes people get a little bit frightened when they buy a bris. The baby maybe is experiencing immense pain, and what are we being cruel? It's not immense pain. We can all calm down, as is evident from the fact that the baby calms down right away. So perhaps we as parents should also calm down right away. Have a wonderful day.